Welcome to In the Oil Patch, presented by SHALE Oil and Gas Business Magazine and sponsored by Steer. In the Oil Patch is where together we learn and explore topics that affect us all in oil and gas, business, and in your community. Every week, our host Kim Bellato, along with me, Alvin Bailey, will visit with the movers and shakers in this fast-paced industry. You'll hear from industry experts, elected officials, and many more right here on In the Oil Patch. Welcome to this week's In the Oil Patch. My name is Alvin Bailey here with Kim Bellato. Hey, Kim, we've got a lot on tap today. Coming up in the next segment, we've got Tom Mullikin of the Mullikin Law Firm. And let me tell you, if this Paris Climate Agreement piques your interest at all, you're going to want to hang around and listen to this interview because Tom Mullikin is sharp and he knows this Paris Climate Agreement, and that's what we're going to be talking about. And that starts in the next segment right here on In the Oil Patch.
Welcome back to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. I'm your host, Kim Bellato, and today we have a very special guest. Tom Mullikin of Mullikin Law Firm is actually an environmental attorney that is going to talk to us today as the expert on this Paris Climate Agreement. Tom, welcome to the show.
Great to be back on the show and appreciate what you're doing to really get some good fact-based information out. I've been in the environmental arena now for a little more than 30 years, 3 decades. Started off as a staffer in the United States Senate on the NOAA subcommittee, and then as a staff member on the U.S. House. I dealt with environmental issues. Been practicing in this area for a very long time, and my practice is applied environmentalism, and my clients have ranged from some of the largest privately held companies in the world, Fortune 100 companies, energy producers, large manufacturers, to all the way to the UN Development Program, UNDP, where I've done work. Finished a major project last year down in Fiji on seabed mining. So I've had a range of clients and occupy a fairly unique space where my position has been, unless and until we combine economic sustainability with environmental sustainability, we'll never have the latter. People won't do what they can't afford to do. But the good news is we can protect the environment and our economy at the same time. It's just a more sophisticated conversation. So I'm excited to be back on the show and hopefully share some really, I believe, will be some unique perspective on these issues.
Well, one of the hottest topics right now that is all over the airwaves is Trump's desire to exit the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I know you're an expert in this area, and so it's timely to talk about this because I believe that depending on what side of the belief that you are on, this is either going to be a really good thing for the United States or it's going to be not a good thing for the world and includes the United States. So I want to start off with just the Paris Agreement because this has been something that has been in the works from the United Nations, or with the United Nations has been working on this for more than 2 decades, and it was supposed to include about 190 countries. That being said, specifically with the United States in mind, we were the main nation that was going to be involved with this. So I want to talk a little bit about first, tell me about the Paris Agreement and why was it important to exit this agreement for the United States? Let's start with that first.
Great. Thanks, Kim. And maybe I should have mentioned that I serve on the faculty as a research professor in the doctoral program at Coastal Carolina University in the College of Science, where I teach climate, and also as an adjunct down in South America, University of San Francisco, Quito, where I teach a class on climate twice a year out in the Galapagos.
So you're definitely an expert in this area. This isn't somebody just giving an opinion. You are the expert in this area.
Well, it's an area that I've been hired as an expert. I served last year as an expert for National Geographic, where I lectured on climate on one of their trips. So it is an area that I've been involved in for a very long time. And it requires some historical understanding of how we've gotten to the point that we have. In 1992, the UN assembled in Rio at the so-called Earth Summit, where they framed the UN conference, framework conference on climate change. And there they talked about bringing all the world's nations together. In 1997, they reconvened and they framed what would define the environmental movement with the Kyoto Protocol. And that instrument really defined if you were for the Kyoto Protocol, you were for the environment. If you were opposed to it, you were opposed to the environment. And really, that document began to lead this conversation more into politics than the environment. A lot of people don't fully understand that document divided the world up into two different categories of countries. One, developed nations, and then the so-called undeveloped nations. And the developed nations were going to have certain reduction requirements, and the developing nations they had kind of voluntary reporting opportunities. So it's widely reported that developing nations would be something like Ethiopia or Namibia, but little was known that in that group of developing nations were countries like China, which is now the number one polluter, not just emitter of greenhouse gases, but polluter.
Of the world.
India, right, in the world. India, Brazil. And what you saw there was that you began to see movement of operations, so-called hot operations, from countries that are highly developed and highly regulated. The countries, so-called developing nations like those three that are in the top 10, that have scant environmental regulation and less enforcement. And so if you look at what's happened since Kyoto, because Paris is founded on this fractured and failed instrument, you see that it's no longer hypothetical. In 1997, for instance, global emissions were about 36 billion metric tons. Today, 20 years later, they're about 48 billion metric tons. Okay? So that's the number we're worried about. If the U.S. were to reduce, but global emissions were to go up, that would be a failure. That would not be a success. And when you look at it, in that same length of time, this 20-year period of Kyoto, the U.S. in 97 was at 6.16 billion, and today it's just barely over 6.2. So by and large, static, almost no change. China, on the other hand, was 3.9 billion and is now 11.4 billion. That's almost 8 billion metric ton increase. And so what I'm telling you is it's not just about the economy. What brings us here is to talk about the environment.
It's more about the politics. It's more about the politics and how it was kind of hijacked, this conversation on climate. Tom, we do have to take a real quick break. You are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. I'm your host, Kim Pilato. Today, we are with Tom Mullikin of the Mullikin Law Firm. And before the break, we were talking about China and how the Paris Climate Agreement has kind of been hijacked, if you will, by politics. So let's get back on the topic of China and how China is not really held as accountable as the United States per se, and yet they've actually alarmingly continued to pollute the planet even more than the United States or any other country. So I want to get back on that topic. Tell me a little bit about China.
All right, thanks, Kim. Let's talk about this, because what we've seen with this fractured and failed document, Kyoto, that would lead to the Paris Agreement, is that the world was divided up into developed and developing nations. Now you have China, the number one emitter of greenhouse gases and the number one polluter in the world, being largely exempt from these requirements. And so why does that make a difference? We only have one atmosphere. And we know that China is the largest emitter of ambient mercury in the world, for example, and one of the largest emitters of ambient mercury in the United States. We also know that China is one of the largest emitters of particulate matter and of sulfates in the western states. So that as we have moved regulated industry from the U.S. and other developed nations into China, we've not only seen this dramatic increase in greenhouse gases, we've seen a dramatic increase in other listed pollutants. And so I tell you that this failed framework that the UN has set up that began with Kyoto is not only making matters dramatically worse with greenhouse gases, we are now choking as citizens of the United States. We're choking on the pollution of their success because we are sending smokestack and other operations into an utterly unregulated environment. And what we need, people we have to have a global perspective. To the extent that we want to reduce greenhouse gases, it is a failed approach to divide this up into halves. It's like going into a restaurant and saying we're going to have no smoking on this half of the room, and thinking that the other half of the room isn't going to get to smoke.
Exactly. It's like secondhand smoke. Give me a break. If somebody's smoking in the room with you, you are susceptible to being to getting cancer too, just by secondhand smokes. And that was always the thing that bothered me, Tom, is how is it that other countries really have very little accountability over climate, and yet the United States is regulated so much. And it always just made me feel, as just somebody that is not in the energy sector, that as a person of the community, there's something wrong with this picture here.
Well, the United States Constitution makes clear in Article 2 that for an international treaty to become effective, it has to have the advice and consent of the Senate. And I think that President Obama knew that he would not gain their support. People look at the Kyoto, the previous agreement, as if it was purely partisan, and yet the test vote that was held on the Senate floor failed 98 to nothing. It was not a partisan vote. It was a national vote. It was an American vote. And I believe that with this accord, it would have met the same destiny. It would not have passed the United States Senate. And so you have constitutional issues for its enforcement. And looking at it, it's failed because of what it does to the environment, but it fails a constitutional scrutiny as well. I really believe that President Trump has an opportunity to demonstrate real informed leadership with the environment. The climate has changed throughout all the time. And one of the mistakes that I think fellow conservatives make is to say the climate's not changing. The climate's changed throughout all the time.
Climate, but Tom, the climate is always changing. It has always changed. It just depends on in what way is it changing. We have to take a real quick break. You are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. I'm your host, Kim Bellato, and today's guest, Tom Mullikin with the Mullikin Law Firm. Tom, before the break, we were talking about how the environment is always forever changing, and somehow or another, this Paris climate agreement. How is this going to change the United States stance and the environment?
I believe that because of the failed nature of Kyoto and its successor agreements like Paris, there's a chance that the environment will actually benefit by us withdrawing participation, because you may begin to see an end to manufacturing and other regulated industry moving from developed nations to undeveloped. And we've talked about the increase in illicit pollutants and about the U.S. choking on the pollution of China's success, mercury, sulfates, particulate matter. Where there's an opportunity for leadership in this country is where we've seen market-based approaches to the environment. We look at this, many of the same people that speak vociferously about reducing greenhouse gases don't know what those gases are. So just very quickly, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, perfluorocarbon, hydrofluorocarbon, sulfur hexafluoride. And then we go to sectors and sources. How do we find, like, as an example, methane here in the United States? Much of that's coming off of solid waste landfill. We have the technology to cap and extract and put that methane on our grid. What are those opportunities that we can find economic and environmental sustainability together? Because where we find those things, we see real progress. Why would you think that we've stayed basically flatline on greenhouse gases while China has tripled its greenhouse gases? What we've seen is through things like technology advances like hydraulic fracturing, where we put more natural gas into our grid. Where we've seen market-based advances, we've seen environmental protection. And where you go around the world, and I've led expeditions to every continent, where you see robust economies, you also see the greatest environmental protection. What we've done through these agreements is exactly counterintuitive. We have moved manufacturing from areas where there's enforced environmental standards to where they're not. We've seen it go to China, Vietnam, Cambodia, where there are real challenges with the environment. That's not good for our economy. and it's not good for our global environment. We need an informed conversation on this. So I feel very strongly that taking a step back from Paris, and if we want to negotiate an international agreement, negotiate one where all the world's countries are parties to it, not half the world are exempted from it. And I know I've made that point, but I want to make clear that in 1997, when Kyoto was first framed, it eliminated 48% of the world's emissions from capturing under its reduction. In other words, those so-called developing nations in 1997 were 48% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. You cannot reduce global emissions where half the world is written out.
That's right. That's right. And that's what is so amazing about this. And yet you see, and I just see this from the Democratic Party and the media just covering that this is a great thing and that, the environment is important. Well, I think that all of us in the world find the environment to be important. It doesn't matter if you're an R or a D, you're a human being, you have children, family, and everybody wants a good, safe environment. But it just makes no sense when other countries are still being allowed to pollute. There is no sincere desire to fix or correct and everybody get on the same page. It's more of this is a political thing going on here of controlling a specific either R or D. And so what I want to talk about are a specific party. I really want to talk about how India, well, first of all, China has been building these coal-fired plants to the tune of pretty much one about every week. And then you've got India making an announcement that they are going to bring online 175 new coal-fired power plants. So tell me how this works. If they're in this Paris agreement to start watching the environment and regulating it and let's start reducing these greenhouse gases and taking care of the environment, how do you bring on all of these coal power plants and as many as they are doing? And then yet it seems like other countries like the United States are having to pull back and pull back and pull back. And it goes back to the argument you were making just a few minutes ago, which is the United States is being regulated to stop producing, which takes us into being potentially not as strong as a country, while other countries are going to continue to do exactly what they have always done in the past and continue to build their manufacturing and their global presence, but yet they don't have to change anything. And is this the reason why Trump is pulling out of this Paris agreement? Because it is not, it's a farce. It's not beneficial. It's actually beneficial for other countries and not for the United States. What do you say to that, Tom?
It's not beneficial to our economy. It's not beneficial to the environment either. When we talk about bifurcated approach, you mentioned India and China. You might throw Brazil in. Each of those three countries were non-Annex 1. Those were developing nations. They're not going to be bound by the same type of emission reduction requirements. You follow what I'm saying? What you said, they're not going to have to meet those same requirements.
And so then we're not really serious about, as a planet, getting all of these developing countries along with the developed countries all on the same page. And until that happens, I do kind of understand where Trump is going. We need to pull back. This was a bad deal. This was a poor deal for the United States. It doesn't benefit us. Let's get back to the table and talk about something that really does. If we need to talk about it, let's talk about it, and let's get all the countries involved in it. And with that, Tom, we do have to take a real quick break. You are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. We'll be right back. And we are back. You are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today, Tom Mullikin with Mullikin Law Firm. Tom, before the break, we were still continuing to talk about these other countries that are considered and labeled developing, and yet this Paris Climate Agreement kind of excludes their ability to watch the environment or control what they're putting out into the world or our planet. I want to go to another topic, which is the methane rule and greenhouse gas, so that way we all understand. There is some discussion on what about this rule and a ruling that came out, so I'll let you talk on that topic. Tell us about the methane rule.
What we've seen over the last 8 years is the manifestation of people who really believe that protecting the environment meant closing down or sharply limiting energy production in this country and manufacturing in this country. And they used every tool available to them in order to impact the ability to be profitable. One of the areas that's recently been looked at in Congress and was going to be, through congressional action, was going to be repealed was so-called methane rule that was promulgated by the Bureau of Land Management. It was going to effectively eliminate methane flaring or drilling on federal land. It was really an attack on the industry. And I think this gets to the broader issue, Kim, that people, you just have to understand that climate and greenhouse gases are first a global issue. And then what happens is liberals talk about greenhouse gas emissions as if all the greenhouse gases that are emitted are from human sources, or what they would refer to as anthropogenic interference. Human release anthropogenic interference is less than 6%, okay? And then the United States is a small percentage of that. And then methane is a small percentage of that. And then oil and gas is a small percentage of that, which is released. And then that on federal lands is small. And so by the time you get around and looking at what impact that would have in terms of impacting the environment, that it's suggesting that it's being promulgated to protect, it's barely a scintilla. On the other hand, the impact that it has on industry and on independents and on others that are struggling to survive in this global marketplace, it's profound. And I think that what we have to have as conservatives is people who can carefully articulate issues dealing with these gases in a world where all of the scientific participation appears to be left of center. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes. It's all lined up.
It's
left to center, meaning it is these liberal people who have the desire to regulate oil and gas out of its existence without really having any real, because I say fact-based scientific data because just as many scientists say it's real, just as many scientists say it's not real. If we were to go through this, what would be the ramifications for the United States? What were we looking at?
We're going to be looking at, in order to have a solid manufacturing, the backbone of the U.S. economy, we have to have abundant, affordable, and safe energy. To the extent that we increase the cost of energy production by virtue of taxes or more unnecessary regulation, we deal negatively with our ability to keep manufacturing. So we're going to deal with that. Annually, we spend nearly $200 billion on foreign sources of fuel, a percentage of which goes directly to the countries that we're fighting. So we've moved from economic security into national security. We in fact, in some areas of the world, are funding opponents of our national security. The cost to deal with this issue wrong are manifest. They're large and they're across the boards. They will mischaracterize Paris as a global agreement. It's not a global agreement if all countries aren't treated the same. And that's the reason why I go back to that which started this conversation was Kyoto, and they are trying to build a house on a defective foundation. It will be better for the global environment. If they want a global agreement, they need to negotiate a truly global agreement that treats each nation the same. And they could do that because China, these developing nations, are the ones that are running global greenhouse gas emissions at an alarming rate. I mentioned to you from 1997 to 2017, it's no longer hypothetical. These numbers have increased from 36 billion to now almost 48 billion. Those increases have largely come from developing nations.
That's right, Tom. That's right.
So it's a bad agreement. To the extent we want one, let's negotiate one, and let's quit mischaracterizing what we have in front of us. It's bad agreement and it's bad process, constitutionally defective.
I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. But with that, we are going to have to close the show. Tom, since President Trump has announced that we are pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I look forward to having you back on as the media spins it. We're here to really get the scoop and tell our listeners what the real truth is. So thank you for being a guest on the show, and we look forward to having you back. But before you go, if one of our listeners want to get a hold of you to ask more information about the Paris climate control deal, where can they contact you?
TomMullikin.com. That's TomMullikin.com. TomMullikin.com at the Mullikin Law Firm, or they can call me directly on my mobile. So blow it up if you're listening to this and you don't agree. 803-425-7771. Thanks so much. Enjoyed being with you.
Thanks, Tom, for being a guest on our show today, and congratulations because you are the topic of today's trivia. Hey, be the first person to email the correct answer to trivia at radio@shalemag.com. Again, that's radio@shale, SHALE, and you'll win yourself a $100 gift certificate to Fogo de Chao, an amazing Brazilian steakhouse. Today's trivia question is, today's guest, Tom, what firm does he work for? Again, today's guest, Tom, what firm does he work for? Remember, be the first person to email the correct answer to radio@shalemag.com, and you will win a $100 gift certificate to Fogo de Chao Brazilian Steakhouse. Well, that's all the time we have for this show. Be sure to like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/In the Oil Patch Radio Show. And follow us on Twitter @ShaleMag. That's going to be a wrap for another great show. We look forward to seeing you next week with more exciting news and insightful interviews. Adios.